And I'd like to also thank the New Hampshire Humanities for supporting this event, and thanks everybody who's here. Tonight's program is New Hampshire's One-Room Schools, The Romance and the Reality, presented by Mr. Steve Taylor. And I'll tell you a bit about him. He is a writer, a farmer, a longtime scholar of New Hampshire rural history. He was the founding executive director of the New Hampshire Humanities Council, and Steve lives in Meriden Village, where he operates a livestock and maple farm with his 3 sons. He has been a dynamic presenter for many years, and we are so pleased that he agreed to join us in front of our very own Guile School to speak to us tonight. Without further ado, Mr. Steve Taylor.
Couldn't be a better spot, you know. It's wonderful. Yeah. Lovely drive down here. It's just about 100 miles from where I live. I live over in a little village called Meriden, and it's in the town of Plainfield. I always ask when I go around the state, show of hands, how many have ever heard of Plainfield, New Hampshire? Well, about 50%. Yeah. Well, one night I was up in Carroll County and there was about 80 people. And then one hand went up. They'd never heard of Plainfield, New Hampshire. And then I found out that man was from Parsonsfield, Maine. I mean, nobody in that town knew ever heard of Plainfield. Well, anyway, if you don't know where it is, it's over on the Connecticut River on the Vermont border. Think as Hanover, Lebanon, Plainfield, Cornish, Claremont. Okay, we're always historically been a very strong farming town. We still have some wonderful agriculture in our town, but we've essentially become a bedroom town for the Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center and Dartmouth College, and it's accelerating. Really, it's unbelievable the change in a few years. It's the town where I grew up. And to see the incredible change of these people coming in, they're highly educated, they're very well paid, they're good neighbors, but they work very hard. They don't really have much time for community. You know, they're on. It's a real grind. What they do is very important. But just to give you an idea how it's changed in the town, the last year I was selected was 1978. There were 4 physicians that lived in the town, and now we have over 80. And I'm not even talking about all the nursing personnel, all these administrators, and they have research scientists and all of these other people that are part of that organization, which is just like all of healthcare is getting bigger and bigger and more powerful all the time. I'm so taken with this arrangement here. You train and get the school out. Now, you said you had 9 at one time. 9. And how many are still standing?
7.
There are 7. And most of them residences now?
Yes.
Yeah, that's typical. But that's pretty good, 7 out of 9. I've been to towns where they had 16, they got 1 left, and it's falling down, you know. But you've done a good job. You've taken some pride in saving what you got, and it's wonderful to see it. And anyway, I'm going to talk about a little bit about the one-room schools. I want you to know right off the bat that I'm a product of a one-room school. I started out in September 1945 at the Tracy School, which is just over the line from the farm where I grew up, just over the line in Cornish. But Cornish and Plainfield, they swapped kids back and forth and so on. And so it made a difference which town you were from. We went to town, school was near it. So the Tracy School, there were all 8 grades and 23 kids in that school. And it was an amazing institution. And it was run and taught by a woman named Eva Hill Bernard. Mrs. Bernard began teaching at the age of 16. And she would teach in the one-room schools of Plainfield and Cornish for 58 years. All right. And she ran a wonderful school. It was just amazing. It all worked. And by today's standards, we'd say it was very progressive or innovative or whatever. But she did it in many different ways to make it happen. But she'd have the 8th grade girls help the 1st graders with their ABCs. 7th grade girls might help the kids in the 2nd grade with their numbers. The 8th grade boys that keep fire going. And the 7th grade boys, their job was to go down to the dairy farm down the hill and fetch a bucket of water. And they'd come back with this bucket of water and they'd pour it into a big crock sat on a table in the corner and a little spigot on the bottom of it. Now this was 1945 and wartime rationing was still in force. So there were no Dixie cups, no Solo cups, anything like that. We were all given a little square of wax paper, maybe about half this size right here. And we were taught how to fold that wax paper in such a way as to make a little cup. That was our drinking cup for the week. And I'll tell you folks, over the years, ever since, I've always tried to redo that cup, make it again. No way. And I've had folks at the lecture come up and say, gee, here, look, here's how you do it. Grab a piece of paper and fold it up. See, there it is. I go home, I still can't do it. It's amazing. But the thing I remember most about the Tracy School, my experience there were 3 of us in the 1st grade. And the experience there was that Mrs. Bernard would stand around on the playground during recess, and she'd have a notepad and a pencil, and she'd write down anything that she heard that was bad grammar, you know. And on Friday at 1 o'clock, she'd call the Good English Club to order. And she would call out the name of somebody like me. She might say, Stevie Taylor. And you'd stand up beside your desk. Yes, Mrs. Bernard. And she'd say, I heard you say, I ain't got my coat today. What should you have said? Mrs. Bernard, you know, a little intimidated. I should have said, I don't have my coat today. And she said, okay, you may sit down. And you never forget lessons like that, I want you to know. It was amazing. But after the 1st grade, I got moved over to a 2-room school a little bit further away. And the only difference between that school and the Tracy School was that it did have a flush toilet. It was the same as a 1-room school, but it had 2 rooms. So anyway, when I was working on putting this talk together, I started out at the state library. Figured that's the place to go and has all kinds of information. Well, it wasn't true. The reference librarian there helped me a lot, and we spent a couple of hours. Basically what it boiled down to was that there's almost nothing that's narrative composed on a statewide basis about the 1-room district schools. There's some numbers, you know, a little bit of this, enrollments, that sort of thing, but nothing that tells a story. So that librarian said, well, go to the state library. They can help you over there. No, not state library. State Historical Society, they can help you over there. All right, I go over there. Same thing. And I said, we don't have anything that you're looking for. He said, but here's what you do. You go to your town histories, and you go to your old town records. That's where the stories are. And you can work on it. And he was absolutely right. There's some towns in New Hampshire have wonderful town histories. And, you know, I'm just thinking of one, for instance, is Washington, a little tiny town up in Sullivan County. And they've got a 2-volume town history. And there are about 3 chapters in there devoted to the schools of Washington. You know, very, very thorough and very, very helpful. And then town reports and old town records are of great help too. Although, you know, a lot of towns in New Hampshire, it's very sad, there'll be blocks of town records that don't exist. And that was because so many towns, the records were kept in the home of the town clerk. And the town clerk's house burned down. And they'd lose all those records. So you could have a gap. Or you could have way up to like 1890 or 1900 where the town didn't have any records to speak of, which is really tragic when you think about it. But anyway, I focus for this little talk under the period between 1880 and 1920, just that window right there, about 50 years. It was the time when the numbers of one-room district schools hit the peak. I mean, there were literally thousands of them in New Hampshire. And then began the precipitous decline. They were being closed wholesale. They were just shrinking in number. And so, and I'll speak a little bit about why. When we talk about the one-room school, there's a lot of what I call romance to it. Quite a lot of it is based on the truth, and a lot more is on the myth. The thing about it is, these were a noble experiment, and really traced back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1600s, when by consensus, they pretty much ordained that every community will try to afford the children the basics of education, a chance to learn to read and to write and do simple arithmetic. And that idea came to New Hampshire in the 1600s. Now this is different from what the people who settled here, coming primarily from England, knew from back in England. In the British Isles, the education of children was pretty much restricted to the children of the nobility, the royalty, and the very wealthy. But the average people, the masses, they were on their own. But here they said, we're going to do it differently, and that idea stuck. And really, New England was a leader by 100 years of doing that, of getting local education going to give people a basic footing to succeed in life. And in that sense, it's really a great experiment in democracy that they were able to accomplish. They tried to educate everyone. Everybody could come. When we talk about these, we're apt to put the yardstick of our own experience of how it is today up against what we know about the running of schools back then. We have to be careful about that, because they did the best they could with what they had, with the knowledge they had, the resources they had. So don't go too hard on them. There are a lot of things by today's standards we say, not so, they're not great, but that was it. These were hyper-local enterprises. That's why there were so many of them. They built schools to accommodate, let's say, a little second grade girl. How far could she be reasonably expected to walk? And that was typically 1.5 miles, 2 miles. So they built a building, and a radius of service from that building would be about 1.5 miles out, or 2 miles. You know, you hear all these incredible stories that pass down through, they get bigger and crazier. You know, they walked 8 miles to school, you know, uphill both ways, and the snow drifts were 10 feet high. That is baloney. That is not what happened. But these schools were local, and very local, and and that's why there were so many of them. And like Mrs. Bernard's school, classes were intimate, small, almost ungraded, and by today's standards we'd say they were almost experimental. But another thing we lose sight of about these one-room schools is this: they served as community centers. They were focus of community. Hello? Yeah. I was afraid it's going to be one of those alarms where beep, 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 beep. Oh, goodness. Anyway, but they were local. I mean, you might have a wedding reception in one, or you'd have a Christmas party for the community gather in the school. And really more so than the Grange in churches, because they were more neutral. You didn't have to have religious affiliation or join a secret society to be a participant, and you could come. And they were particularly important during the period I'm talking about, which was when rural New Hampshire was hemorrhaging population. People were packing up and moving away en masse. And the the numbers of population, town by town, in rural areas of New Hampshire during that period. Post-Civil War up to really the 1940s, there's just precipitous decline in population. My little town, it lost 30% of its population between 1860 and 1890. 40% of its tax base. Good people just went away and they abandoned the farms, let them grow up to trees. And if the town had railroad or it had some mills, it didn't suffer as badly. But the rural areas, which had been primarily agricultural, they just shriveled. There are areas over in my part of the state where population went from between 1860 and 1920. They went from 1,200 to 200. Can you imagine? And that's where, that was when they just said, it's going back to the Indians. Land had been cleared at enormous toil. Let's just abandon, let it grow up to trees. Mother Nature wants all of New England to be trees. You get out of her way, you'll have trees in almost no time. So that was what was going on. Well, it gets you to the reality, again, from today's perspective, we have to say it was kind of a hard road. But the earliest colonial, well, it wasn't really a law and an enactment in New Hampshire is from around 1694. It's basically saying that towns, communities should use the tax power to support education. In 1837, up to 1837, the selectmen were the de facto school boards. And the legislature said in 1837, well, I got too much to do. Let's have them appoint a school board. So that was the beginning, really, of an appointed of a school board. Later, they would become elected, as we are familiar with today. But the evolution of leadership of the governance of schools is a very interesting story. Up to about 1885, you'd have two committees running a school district. One would be the superintending committee, and they would evaluate the teacher and develop the curriculum and do that sort of thing. And then there'd be a prudential committee, and sometimes it would consist of one person, and that person would control the money. And so they were the ones that got the wood supply for the stove, they got the roof fixed, and they hired the teacher. So we had that. Well, so you might have a town where if you had two committees for each school, and you got 9 schools, you have 18 committees functioning around town. The legislature in 1885 said this is crazy, and they basically passed a law that said there'll be one committee to run schools in every town, and it shut down all these many little district-sized committees. And there was a lot of pushback, and people, oh, it's terrible, we can't have that. So the legislature said, okay, you've got to try this new system for 5 years, and if you don't like it, you can go back. You can vote to go back. None of them ever did. Okay. So they stuck with it, and that's what we have today. We have one school board basically running the local school district. Well, now another thing happens in 1885, which is enormously significant. The legislature passed a law that said women can vote in school district affairs and they can hold office in the schools. Now that's radical when you think about it, because universal suffrage was really almost a half century away. And that was passed. And I credit the Grange movement for a lot of that. Grange was a rising power in New Hampshire public affairs, beginning right in the late 1870s. And the Grange's organizational principle, when it was founded way out in Minnesota right after the Civil War, was to include women as full equals in the order, and to allow women to hold any office in the Grange. And so I think some of that spilled over. Women said, hey, it's good enough for the Grange, how about it can be good enough for our school? But the women are more concerned about the educational welfare of children than a lot of men are, and so it made sense. Well, up in Washington, as I mentioned, the beautiful town history they have, they said word got around in 1886 that there was a woman and she was going to run for the school board. Ah, oh boy. And so they had a huge turnout to make sure she didn't get elected. But by golly, the following year, she did get elected. And I found where she served for about 10 years. And during the 1890s, you look through, you find women on the majority of school boards, very often 2 out of 3. So, you know, it was a revolutionary thing, and it happened very quickly, thank heavens. Anyway, for a while the state was, you know, tinkering around on the perimeters here. It didn't set any standards to speak of about what shall be taught, and it just left it up to the districts. And it didn't set any standards for how long school had to keep. Now bear in mind there was great disparity between these individual school districts within their town. You might have a school down in the village, they might have some mills down there and some stores and some real estate, so they had some tax base. And then there'd be another district up on the mountainside, about all they had up there was maybe a farm or 2 and some trees. And so they didn't have the tax bill. And so that's why you find in the 1880s, up into the 1890s, some schools would keep for 20 or 25 weeks a year. Others would keep for 5 weeks or even less. And if it was snow, they didn't bother to keep school. They just shut it down. So you had wide disparity. Well, when realization began to set in that this was unfair to children, the legislature at the turn of the 20th century, in about 1901, passed a law that said all school districts, all towns, shall offer the same number of weeks of schooling to every child. And so, again, the town said, oh, well, how can we do that? We don't have the base. So the legislature said, okay, you can hire somebody with a horse and buggy and bring kids from off the mountain, bring them down to the village school. That's the beginning of public transportation of school children. I don't know about your town here, but up my way, we have 3 great big yellow school buses. And they go by my front door. Holy smoke, all I can see is 1 or 2, maybe 3 little heads in there. Wait a minute. But if you get down to the school at 7:45, there might be 70 or 80 SUVs pulling up, letting kids out. So there's some kind of a disconnect there. But so anyway, getting a uniform approach to the amount of schooling that could be offered, that was a real, very important role, reform. Now, as time went on, this disparity in between various districts within the town, that was always festering. Then when they abolished that concept, said it's all one town, well, we jumped to the same thing. We had towns that didn't have much tax base, and then we had towns that had a lot of tax base. Now, does this sound familiar? It's 120 years or so later, and we're still fighting over that. It's unbelievable. And if you don't believe me, I'll take you to Claremont. You can go drive around and you'll say, boy, this place is rust belt. You know, it's broken down. It is broken. They have all the pathologies of the rust belt, you know, opiate stuff and high rates of cancer and teen pregnancy and all those things. Then I can drive you 25 miles to the north and take you to Lebanon or Hanover, and you look at the schools up there, they're Cadillac schools, and they have all kinds of tax base, you know, shopping centers, factories, biomedical laboratory companies, I mean, just all that stuff. So you have that great disparity. Back in those days, we're still kind of wrangling over it today. When you get to facilities, some schools, some of these little schools were built to last, and that one sure was. Somebody did the right job, and a lot of them were done on the cheap. They were pretty much thrown up with whatever materials they had, and as you say, some towns today have houses, residences that are made out of schoolhouses. And some will have like a museum or 2. A couple of towns I've been to, an old one-room school is the town clerk's office, and another one It's the reading room, children's reading room for the library. I think that's Brentwood. You probably know about that one, and so on. They I have yet to find a one-room school that was built over a dug cellar hole. They just put them down on rough stone foundation, and that was it. And what that enabled them to do very often, and they were always doing this, it doesn't have enough usage here, and they need a better school over there. They jack it up, slide some timbers under it, hitch up the oxen, drag it down the road, and move it over there. In the town of Lyme, they did a study. Lyme had 16 schoolhouses at the peak, and they found that 7 of them ended up somewhere else from where they were built. And quite often, an interesting footnote is the schools would be built kind of on a handshake. Somebody might come on and say, well, we need a school in this neighborhood, and go to whoever the farmer was, say, here, how about up the corner of your pasture? Say, okay, if we put a school up there, all right? And I said, yeah, sure, go ahead. And go along, and over time, there'd be some issues in the 1960s and 70s when the banks started demanding clear titles and good surveys and all that stuff. And so you find in the 60s and 70s, a lot of towns around New Hampshire passing articles to allow the selectmen to quit claim a little piece of land that once was the site of a school. And in my county, it's really crazy up there. Anybody that ever researches titles in Sullivan County, they'll tell you these fabulous stories. Because in those days, down through history, they had a lot of lay people who drew up deeds. And in my lifetime, there was a man in Plainfield, if you went with a $10 bill and tossed it down on the table, he'd type you up a deed. And you'd dictate the description. And you could take it over to Newport and they'd record it. So that's it, no problem. One of the best ones that a friend of mine as a lawyer came across, and said, and this is in Sullivan County, said to describe this piece of land, said, beginning at the oak tree where the cow had the calf. They laid it out. Well, occasionally we find that the one-room school was actually in the house of somebody who rented out their front parlor, let's say. Not common, but it did happen. These facilities, of course, were very simple. They had wood stoves, they weren't insulated, they have a privy, a bell, and they often got moved around. Oftentimes the biggest facilities issue was who's going to get the deal to provide the firewood. It was almost a cashless economy in those days. I had a chance to make a few dollars selling wood to the town. That was a big deal. People compete to get it. You sell a cord of wood or 3/4 cords of wood for $3 a cord. That was right. Now, we talk about curriculum. What's really amazing, in the absence of the state saying much of anything, was how uniform the curriculum was all over the place. It must have moved through the rock formations or something, because it's commonality wherever you look. Arithmetic, geography, penmanship, grammar, reading, spelling, and history. And that was pretty much the core curriculum, and pretty much everybody taught. It is amazing without the state standing over their shoulders and said, do it this way. Except one very interesting thing, and this was in 1883, where the legislature passed a law that required teaching of physiology and hygiene in the schools, with particular emphasis on the effects of alcohol and stimulants. Well, I looked at them, what the hell? How come? What was going on? Well, it turns out that the temperance movement in New Hampshire, which was very powerful, very potent, they convinced the legislature in 1883 that there were 60,000 drunkards in New Hampshire. But if you look at the population of the state, they were saying that every 6th or 7th person was a drunkard. Now, I don't know what kind of effect teaching in the grade school about all of that had, but that was the stab they took at it. Another challenge for teachers in those years was textbooks were provided by the pupils, and very often they were hand-me-downs. Grandfather went to school and had this book, and he passed it to his daughter, and she had it, and he passed it to her daughter. Imagine trying to teach class, and every kid may have a different textbook. So in 1897, the legislature said, okay, every kid gets the same textbook in each school. Well, that's quite a reform, actually, if you think about it. One of the curious things about this all was that the school board took it upon themselves to evaluate the teacher and the progress of education in each school. And they would go and visit the classroom and observe. They'd come in and stand around the edges of the room and watch. And then they'd write up a report. And some of these reports, when you look at them, they're horrible, nasty. I mean, sad, really, when you think about it. But sort of a variant on that was something, and it was practiced in some towns, not widespread, was what they called a public examination. And that, all people in the community, all people whose children attended the one-room school there in the neighborhood, would come towards the end of the school year, come in the classroom, stand around, watch, and the children were asked to recite. Okay, they might say to a fourth grader, hey, you go to the board and do ×4. Or they might say to a girl, list the capitals of the 6 New England states. Okay, and then afterwards, they'd have a caucus and say, they'd draw up a report and give it to the teacher. They might say, that fella over there, he's kind of dumb, and he needs to stay back. But this little girl over here, smart in hell, let her skip a grade. How about it? And tell, here you go, tell the teacher. Imagine, and we get to teachers, it's amazing when we look back at what those teachers had to endure. Many of them were in their teenage years. In fact, for quite a while, the average age of teachers in these rural schools was about 19. It was very common to take a girl that had done well. At the end of the 8th grade, she's smart, competent, 14 years old. They'd say, okay, Mary, you can go over to this district over here and teach school. And you go, you do it. And that was very common and very widespread. There was, of course, there was continuous turnover during that time, and it was for $3 a week. And so that little girl, a woman, she'd be assigned to that place, be some farmhouse probably. It was a hard road. I found one wonderful kind of a monograph of one teacher reminisced about where she went, and she said that the host family, when they left the premises and she was still there, they would lock up the food so that she wouldn't snack. All right? Not good. The other thing was basically a form of slavery. They wouldn't pay them till the end of the term. Typically it'd be 3 terms a year, and so they just hold back the pay and force them to stay to the end if they want to get any money out of their work. And they, how terrible. I did find one prudential committee guy who found out a teacher let the children go a couple of hours early on the last day of the term, and he docked her pay. Can you imagine? New Hampshire law finally recognized female teachers in 1808, and it said initially it said they can only teach letters in the English language, reading, writing, grammar. By 1827, they were also expected to teach arithmetic. Well, 1858, they said all teachers are to be considered equal under the law. Yeah, equal in what they had to do, but they weren't equal in what they got paid. Teachers also had to keep schools warm. When teachers have to use all of their when the scholars have to use all of their mental faculties in devising methods to keep warm, it is not expected that they can learn much from the textbook. Well, I would believe. Imagine some of that wood might have been green, pretty hard to keep the fire going. To give you an example of the turnover of teachers that was common in that time, again, from my town, there were 16 schools, so theoretically, if you had 3 terms per year in each school, you would have 48 terms the whole year. Well, in actuality, only 32 sessions were kept, so a third never happened. But in that span, those 32 sessions, there were 25 different teachers. You know, imagine a lot of these young women, teenage girls, they'd say, I can't hack it in this school, I don't like the boys that they misbehave, the parents aren't very helpful, I'm out of here. Well, I better find somebody else to teach. So we'll go. Now, irregular attendance was a huge problem. They constantly dealing with sickness. You know, they didn't have the vaccinations we have today against scarlet fever, diphtheria, and measles, and mumps, and all this stuff. And so that was a chronic issue. And then, of course, they had the worst diseases occasionally would come through, tuberculosis, and something we never hear about today, unguent fever, which was contracted from drinking milk of diseased cows. It was like polio. If it didn't kill you, it probably left you crippled. But the most common affliction that disrupted school was what they called the epizootic. Today we call it the stomach bug. Now, they didn't have any understanding of the basics of microbiology, and a lot of them were probably drinking bad water or eating moldy food, who knows what. So they'd have these periodic episodes where everybody in the school was down with the bug, and they stay home. This teacher would be down, so they just shut down school for a couple of weeks. But then, of course, the other aspect was the failure of parents to make kids go to school. There weren't truancy laws in those times. And this was an agrarian culture. And so imagine, let's see, September, the corn is ready to be brought in. So we'll keep the boys home to help harvest the corn. They won't miss anything in school. We need them here on the farm. Well, we got a new baby in the house. Mother needs some help. And keep daughter home. And she can churn butter and wash the overalls and bake bread and so on. So, you know, the teacher had to deal with all this uncertainty all the time. Now, I love to talk about discipline. Great variation reports. So some teachers rule with an iron fist or 18-inch hickory ruler. Others had chaotic conditions. Now that Washington history, it talks about a little 14-year-old girl trying to keep school. And she must have had a couple of real lunkhead boys. Probably they were 15. And if she told them to do something, they didn't feel like doing it. They'd grab a hold of her and throw her out the window. Oh boy, wicked. Well, we get to World War I time, post turn of the 20th century. We begin to take some of the rough edges off this. A lot of things began to fall into place. One very notable one was the establishment by legislative act of the position of school superintendent. Now, initially, the school superintendent's job was to ride horseback, travel from school to school to help these young teachers learn how to teach or keep control of their class, develop the skills to be successful. So that was how we started with school superintendents, which of course now are enormously powerful positions. And then we began to understand that teachers would do better if we had better preparation for them. And one of the great reforms was the coming of the normal school. You know, normal school, Keene normal school, Plymouth normal school, Maine had a bunch of them, Vermont, Massachusetts, all over the place. But I always wondered, normal school, is that opposed to a abnormal school? Well, it comes from the French, école normale, okay? In the 1870s, France started this program. of bringing prospective teachers together and help them learn good teaching method and build up their competency in subject matter. And then that idea was what came here, and they called them normal schools, copying from that French idea. So right after the turn of the 20th century comes motor car improvements in transportation. People get around better, and with declining populations, schools were down in numbers. A lot of them were being closed, and schools were being consolidated. So with that came the multi-grade schoolroom, and with the multi-grade schoolhouse. With the multi-grade schoolhouse came specialization of teaching. A teacher who specializes in grade 2 or grade 7. And so that was quite a reform and had very profound impact as time went on. But the coming of the motor car and the acceleration of transportation facilitated getting better roads. That really doomed the school, the one-room school, as much as anything. So I ask you to assess the phenomenon of the rural one-room school in the context of the times. Number one being the decline in population, as I said. Rural New Hampshire was hemorrhaging population, same in Vermont, same in Maine, Western Mass, it was all the same. People were leaving to go west to farm, or they were going to work in the great mills of the Merrimack Valley, or down to Holyoke and Chicopee and so on. And then during that time, there was a lot of conflict about education. A community of people who said, all my son needs to succeed is be able to read and write and a little bit of arithmetic. Same with my daughter. What she needs to know, she'll learn from her aunts and her grandmother and so on. And so she doesn't need a lot of education. Then you had a lot of people who said, the world's changing, industrialization, people got to be better educated, we need to go in that direction. And in a way, you still hear that today. I know in my town school meetings, somebody will get up and say, well, when I went to school, we didn't have to worry about that stuff. No, you didn't, but today we do. I've talked enough about the treatment of women, or the mistreatment of women. And then, this still plays out a lot. Disagreement over the values of the small school versus the consolidated bigger school. A lot of people said, I like my little one-room school. I get my arms around it. I know the teacher. I know all the parents of all the kids. And that's the way it should be. And other people say, no, well, that's all right, but we need to be able to do better. If we bring our kids together, have a multi-graded schoolhouse, we do better by those children. That still plays out today. It's a very interesting case study of that. It's up in western New Hampshire. There's a Kearsarge Regional School District. It takes in about 7 or 8 towns, New London, Bradford, Warner, all that area. And when it was formed in the early 70s, everybody assumed that Sunapee would be part of it. Well, they came out with a proposal. Sunapee said, no, don't want anything to do with it. And they've stuck to that decision. And it's very interesting. Kearsarge High School, this year they graduated about 200 kids. Sunapee graduated about 24. And a lot of people in Sunapee say, our kids don't get the variety of programs, advanced placement, all that stuff. Other people say, that's all right, no problem. So there it is. Anyways, and they've been having a big battle across the river from me in Vermont. They go on and on about it. They've got too many schools, they're too small. The legislature wants to slim them down. But when you do that, it means a lot of kids are riding in a school bus 30, 40 minutes. Over hill and dale, and a lot of people are unhappy. So that battle goes on. Now I'll wrap it up with a little story. People used to ask me, how many one-room schools are there in New Hampshire that still function? And I would say there are 2, right? Number one, is a school called the Red School. It's red because it's brick. And it purports to be the oldest continuously functioning one-room school in America going back to 1794 in that building. Now it's in the town of Croydon. You may have heard about Croydon and the terrible ruckus going on up there. But anyway, so that one-room school, okay, that's the Red School. And then up in Landaff, up near Littleton, is a school. It's called the Blue School. It is blue. It's almost the color of your top. And they said, that's the Blue School. So we got two. Well, the people in Croydon say, that school up in Landaff, that's not a one-room school. They got a portable classroom hooked onto it. So it's a two-room school. Oh boy. Well, anyway, so 3 summers ago now, I was driving on Route 10, and I went past the Red School, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a portable classroom. I called up the lady in Croydon who knows everything. And I said, see here, I see you got a portable classroom, one-room school in there. No, it's not connected. Oh, anyway, well, I told that story over in New Hampton, and they said, well, you're wrong, because we've got a one-room school here. When they built a consolidated, multi-graded new school in the village, right next door was a very nice little one-room school. They said, let's keep that one, and that is the 4th grade classroom. That's all. If you want, we'll say there are 3. Anyway, does anybody have a comment or a question they'd like to throw at me? Yes, ma'am.
I think most of our teachers in one-room schoolhouses were not married. And I believe I knew a teacher who told me that there was a long time that she taught in public schools, and she could not tell her boss or her school board she was married. About when did that happen, and when did it change?
In New Hampshire, I think it happened just before World War II. That was number one. But then, heaven forbid, if she got pregnant. If she was pregnant, she was all done. Boom, out. And Massachusetts stayed with it way up into the late 60s because there were towns in New Hampshire. They would get women that had maybe almost ready to retire in Massachusetts, and they wanted to have a little break and get out of it, and they came up here and taught, even though they were married and so on. I mean, you know, how archaic can you be? It's ridiculous. Anybody else? Yes, yes.
When you talked about the support of the district schools early on, I was surprised to hear you say something like the people whose students went to that school. I thought the whole town supported all of the school districts, regardless of how many, so I was surprised to hear that.
Well, pre-1885, every little school was a separate, like a separate town. I mean, it was a separate taxing district.
And what about people in that district who had no students?
No, it still had.
Everybody in that district had to pay.
Yeah, just like today, we've got kids in school now, we pay into the.
It's a hallmark of the United States in terms of public education. It goes way back.
Yes.
You mentioned the schools that are still in operation. How many students do those have?
I know the Red School in Croydon is a K through 4, and it has about 24 kids. And that one in Landaff, I'm sorry, not up to date. I'll bet it's about the same size. You know, probably a K through 3, K through 4.
I think Newcastle has maybe 28 or 30 kids in there.
They're small. Their elementary school is very small.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's, you're probably aware of it. I don't know about Raymond, but boy, around the state is a decline in numbers of school kids. It's all over the place in New Hampshire. I think they went from like 113,000 down to in the 90s in the last 5 years. I know my boys all went to Lebanon High School. They graduated in the 70s, and they'd have about 210 kids in their class. The class this year was 142nd. And in my town, we built a new school in the 70s. They had all these consultants that we got a bill for 360 kids. Well, they put up this 360 kids. The closest we ever came was 360, and now we're barely 200. Well, I mean, everybody said, well, what's going on? I say, people aren't having a baby. A lot of young people are delaying. They can't buy a house today. I'm looking at house prices. They're absolutely ridiculous. And I don't know. Before I was 30, I'd owned 2 different houses and had 3 kids. But they would say, I'm not. And people, I tell that to people, I say, I can't be, but that was the way it was. I think we were all, at that time, we could do things like that. But I think it's very troubling, and I don't know what's going to happen. I don't think more consolidation is the answer. I don't think people will stand for it. I mean, if Raymond declined, would they say, okay, send them all to Epping? I don't think Raymond would be too keen on that, right? I mean, am I right? Yeah. Now, does Raymond take in several towns for high school kids?
We've had with other communities,
Yeah.
and then we're on our own. It's the whole New Hampshire way.
Uh-huh.
And now we're considering
Yeah.
trying to attract other students here in order
Uh-huh.
to support the
Yes,
school.
yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's tough.
Yeah. Well, Hanover High School up my way, 10 years ago, they were like a prep school. You had to apply if you weren't from Hanover and North Vermont, the 2 core towns. And they were very picky about who they admitted. Now, they'll take warm bodies. They're going to keep staff out and everything. Yes?
And when you look at the northern communities, I'm from Berlin, Gorham, don't even mention trying to consolidate those schools. There's a war between them. There's
Exactly.
that,
Yeah.
Schools are everything.
As soon as you start talking about trucking the kids for
Right.
long distances, imagine these little first, second graders climbing on a bus and him to sit there 35, 40 minutes, both ends of the day. They may be leaving in the dark, getting home in the dark. It's a real challenge. I don't know what the heck the answer is. I don't. We'll be fighting about it, I'm sure. Anybody else?
So how did New Hampshire compare to the other New England states, our brothers, left, right, and south?
In terms of one room?
One-room schoolhouses, yeah.
I think there's one left in Vermont. I don't know any in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. Maine has, I think about 8 or 9. They're on islands. They're still out there. If you go to Pennsylvania, and there are a lot of them. The Plain people have their one-room school, and they all, their attitude is all the education the child needs is to the 8th grade, and that's it. And they keep up. You go down there. I love to go down there. You see the kids all have scooters. And they ride these little scooters and they kick along. And you see the one-room school, and there'll be a whole bunch of little scooters all lined up. And they have a pay phone for the neighborhood that's at that schoolhouse.
Steve, have you thought about publishing a book on this subject, though? I know there's, a book on New Hampshire's one-room schoolhouses by Bruce Held, but, I don't think it's as detailed as what you've shared with us today.
Yeah. Well, you're probably right. I don't know, but don't look to me to write books. I don't have the gas. Yeah. Okay, well, if you're happy, I'm happy.